Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the mud-caked boots of a medieval peasant farmer. And trust me, your Instagram-filtered life is about to feel like absolute luxury. Picture this. It's 4:30 a.m. in the year 1347, somewhere in rural England. There's no gentle sunrise alarm slowly brightening your bedroom. Instead, a particularly vindictive rooster named something like Bloodbeak is shrieking directly into your ear canal while rain drips through the thatched roof onto your face. You're lying on what can generously be called a mattress, but is actually a burlap sack stuffed with straw that's been marinating in your own sweat, various bodily fluids, and the occasional dead mouse for the past 6 months. The temperature inside your one-room hovel is roughly equivalent to a modern refrigerator, and that's actually an improvement over the howling wind outside. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below letting us know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Are you tucked into Egyptian cotton sheets in California, or maybe wrapped up in a cozy duvet in Manchester? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your eyes snap open not because your well-reset that concept won't be invented for another 600 years, but because something wet and furry just scurried across your chest. Could be a rat. Could be your neighbor's cat hunting said rat. Could be something you'd rather not identify in the pre-dawn darkness. The smell hits you next. A delightful cocktail of human waste, rotting vegetables, wet animals, and that special medieval musk that comes from bathing approximately 4 times per year. Whether you need it or not, you attempt to sit up and immediately understand why medieval people were generally shorter than modern humans. Your ceiling, constructed from whatever wood scraps the local lord's carpenter didn't want, hovers about 5.5 feet above the dirt floor. This is assuming the previous tenant built this architectural marvel properly, which, given medieval building standards, is roughly a 50-50 proposition. The support beam running across the middle of your living space bears suspicious teeth marks, suggesting either termites have been redecorating or your predecessor got desperate during last winter's famine. The rooster Bloodbeak, as we've established, continues his dawn serenade with the enthusiasm of a particularly unhinged opera singer. Medieval roosters, you see, weren't the charming farm animals of children's books. These were hardened survivors of a world where everything from wolves to wandering mercenaries might decide to make chicken dinner, so they developed what historians politely call aggressive territorial behaviors. In layman's terms, your alarm clock has talons and a serious attitude problem. You swing your legs over the side of what passes for a bed and immediately regret every life choice that led to this moment. Your feet hit the dirt floor, and yes, it's literally dirt, not some rustic wooden planking, and the cold shoots up through your legs like medieval acupuncture. The ground is permanently damp, partly from the aforementioned leaky roof and partly from the general dampness that pervades everything in pre-central heating Britain. Your toes encounter something squishy that you sincerely hope is mud but probably isn't. Standing requires a careful navigation around the family's most precious possessions, which consist of approximately 3 wooden bowls, a bent spoon carved by someone who clearly had never seen a proper spoon, 1 blanket that's more whole than fabric, and a cooking pot that's been passed down through so many generations it's achieved the consistency of Swiss cheese. The pot sits in what medieval people optimistically called a kitchen, but modern people would recognize as the corner where food goes to become less edible. Your clothing situation is equally inspiring. Medieval peasants owned exactly 1 outfit, which they wore continuously until it literally fell apart or until they died, whichever came first. Your ensemble consists of a tunic made from what was once wool, but has since achieved the texture of sandpaper, leggings that might have been brown originally, but now display a rainbow of stains chronicling every meal, accident, and agricultural mishap of the past year, and shoes that are less footwear and more foot suggestions. These shoes were crafted by the village cobbler, a man whose understanding of foot anatomy came primarily from watching people walk past his shop. The tunic, by the way, reaches roughly to your knees, which in medieval fashion terms makes you practically a runway model. Peasant clothing served one primary purpose: to stay on your body long enough for you to accomplish basic tasks before disintegrating completely. Fashion considerations ranked somewhere below not dying of exposure and maintaining enough coverage to avoid public indecency charges. You stumble toward the single window, which is really just a hole in the wall covered by a piece of oiled cloth that provides roughly the same weather protection as a particularly thick spider web. Pulling aside this medieval curtain reveals the world outside. A landscape that looks like God decided to experiment with the color brown and then gave up halfway through. Everything: the fields, the other hovels, the wandering livestock, even the sky exists in various shades of brown, gray, and that special color that happens when organic matter begins its journey back to the earth. The village spreads out before you like a medieval urban planning disaster. Houses are scattered randomly across the landscape with all the organization of debris after a tornado. There's no grid system, no logical layout, just buildings wherever someone decided to claim a patch of marginally less swampy ground. The local lord's manor house looms in the distance like a medieval middle finger pointed at your economic prospects, its stone walls and actual glass windows serving as a daily reminder that somewhere, people are living in structures that don't require constant patching with mud and hope. Your neighbors are already stirring in their own architectural miracles. Through the thin walls, and when I say thin, I mean you can hear every conversation, argument, and biological function occurring within a 50-foot radius. You catch the sounds of medieval morning routines. Someone's already arguing with their livestock, probably trying to convince a pig that breakfast time doesn't require a full-scale rebellion. Another neighbor is engaged in what sounds like hand-to-hand combat, but is actually just trying to start a fire with flint and steel, a process that requires the patience of a saint and the vocabulary of a sailor. The communal well sits in what passes for the village center, surrounded by a collection of women who've clearly been awake for hours and are now engaged in the medieval equivalent of a morning coffee clatch. Except instead of discussing reality TV, they're trading rumors about which neighbor's cow might be cursed, and whether the strange lights seen over the forest last week were angels, demons, or just old Henrik wandering around drunk again. Speaking of Henrik, medieval villages were small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business. Medical conditions, family history, and bathroom schedule. Privacy was a luxury that wouldn't be invented until people had enough money to build walls thick enough to muffle sound. Your neighbor's marital problems were as much a part of your daily entertainment as whatever was happening in the fields, mainly because there literally wasn't anything else to watch. No books, no newspapers, no traveling entertainment beyond the occasional minstrel who might be legitimately talented or might just be a criminal fleeing justice in the next county. The morning air carries scents that would challenge even the most hardened modern nose. Medieval villages existed in a state of perpetual fermentation, where human waste, animal waste, food waste, and regular waste all mingled together in a symphony of decomposition that would make a modern sewage treatment plant seem like a perfume factory. Add to this the smoke from various cooking fires, the particular aroma of wet thatch, and the general funk of people who considered bathing a suspicious foreign practice, and you've got an olfactory experience that would probably be classified as a biological weapon by contemporary standards. Your stomach chooses this moment to remind you that medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of sleeping through breakfast. Hunger in the 14th century wasn't the gentle rumbling you might experience between meals. It was a constant companion, a gnawing reminder that your next meal was always uncertain and your meal after that was purely theoretical. The human body, you're discovering, wasn't designed to run on the medieval peasant diet of whatever we can find that isn't actively poisonous. But first, before you can even think about food, there's the small matter of personal hygiene, a concept that medieval people approached with all the enthusiasm of a root canal. Your toilet is located conveniently outside, in a small wooden structure that provides minimal privacy and maximum exposure to the elements. Medieval toilet paper was whatever leaves you could find that weren't too rough, too poisonous, or too recently occupied by insects. The whole experience was less about cleanliness and more about basic biological necessity, accomplished as quickly as possible before something unpleasant happened. The village is slowly waking around you, and with it comes the realization that this isn't a historical reenactment you can leave whenever things get uncomfortable. This is your life now. Every day starts like this, cold, hungry, surrounded by smells that would make a modern person question their will to live, wearing clothes that have achieved sentience through accumulated grime, and facing a day of physical labor that would break most contemporary humans before noon. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants were genuinely happy with their lot or simply had no frame of reference for anything better. But one thing's certain: they developed a level of physical and mental toughness that would make modern survivalists weep with envy. These were people who considered a day without major injury a good day, who measured wealth in terms of how many meals they could go without thinking about food, and who faced daily challenges that would send most of us running back to our climate-controlled homes. Your first medieval morning is just beginning, and you're already questioning every decision that led you to this moment. But there's no going back now. The rooster is still crowing. Your stomach is demanding attention, and somewhere in the distance, you can hear the sound of other peasants beginning their daily struggle against nature, hunger, and the general hostility of medieval existence. The sun hasn't even properly risen yet, and you're already exhausted. The concept of breakfast in medieval times was less the most important meal of the day, and more whatever didn't die, rot, or get stolen since yesterday. You shuffle toward your food storage area, a term that generously describes the corner where you keep things that are theoretically edible. Your pantry consists of a wooden box that's been gnawed by every rodent in the county, and a clay pot that's developing its own ecosystem of mold cultures that would fascinate modern scientists. Inside the box, you discover the crown jewel of medieval peasant cuisine, a loaf of bread that's achieved the consistency of a medieval weapon. This isn't the soft, pillowy bread you might imagine. This is bread that could double as a building material. Medieval peasant bread was made from whatever grains were available, which usually meant barley, and whatever else grew in soil that hadn't been properly fertilized since the Romans left. The wheat went to the Lord's table, leaving you with what historians politely call maslin bread, a term that sounds much more appetizing than whatever grain-like substances we could scrape together. The bread's crust has developed the hardness of medieval armor, requiring you to soak it in liquid before attempting consumption unless you want to risk breaking what's left of your teeth. Medieval dentistry was roughly equivalent to hope for the best and chew on the other side, so tooth preservation was a survival skill. You eye the bread suspiciously, wondering if the dark spots are intentional seeds or whether your loaf has become a condominium for various small creatures. Your beverage options are equally inspiring. Water, in medieval times, was essentially a death sentence in liquid form. Rivers and wells were contaminated with everything from human waste to dead animals to the runoff from various medieval industries that operated under the environmental philosophy of dump it somewhere and forget about it. Smart peasants drank ale, and lots of it. Not because they were all functional alcoholics, though that certainly helped with the existential dread, but because the brewing process killed most of the bacteria that would otherwise turn your digestive system into a medieval torture chamber. You reach for your personal drinking horn, a vessel that serves as cup, bowl, and occasionally weapon, depending on circumstances. Medieval peasants owned very few personal items, and each one served multiple purposes out of sheer necessity. Your horn belonged to some unfortunate cow whose previous owner either ate it, traded it, or lost it in one of the periodic raids that swept through the countryside like medieval natural disasters. The ale you're about to drink would horrify modern beer enthusiasts. Medieval ale was thick, cloudy, and had roughly the alcohol content of modern small beer, which meant you needed to consume substantial quantities to achieve any meaningful effect. It was also flavored with whatever herbs were available, leading to combinations that would make contemporary craft brewers weep. Bog myrtle, ground ivy, and other plants that sound like ingredients in a witch's curse were common additions, creating beverages that tasted like someone had fermented a medieval medicine cabinet. You take a tentative sip and immediately understand why medieval people had such grim expressions in contemporary artwork. The ale hits your taste buds with all the subtlety of a medieval siege engine, delivering flavors that your modern palate interprets as fermented sadness with hints of despair. But its liquid calories and mild alcohol, which in medieval terms makes it practically a health drink. The bread situation requires more creativity. You break off a chunk, or rather, you attempt to break off a chunk, which requires the same amount of force medieval knights used to breach castle walls. Eventually, you succeed in creating several fragments that could charitably be called bite-sized if you have the jaw strength of a medieval ox. These pieces go into your ale for soaking, creating a breakfast soup that looks like something you'd use to patch holes in your roof. While your bread achieves theoretical edibility, you inventory the rest of your food supplies with growing concern. There's a piece of cheese that's developed its own weather system, complete with what appears to be precipitation. Medieval cheesemaking was an art form practiced by people who understood that properly aged cheese should be able to survive longer than the people eating it. Your particular specimen has achieved a level of aging that puts it somewhere between fermented dairy product and biological experiment. The cheese, assuming it is still cheese and not some new form of life, represents a significant portion of your protein intake. Medieval peasants didn't eat meat with the casual frequency of modern people. Meat was expensive, hard to preserve, and usually reserved for special occasions like not dying of starvation or the Lord is visiting and we need to pretend we're not completely destitute. Your livestock were more valuable alive than dead, providing milk, eggs, and labor that kept you marginally above the starvation line. You also discover a small collection of root vegetables that have been stored in what medieval people optimistically called a root cellar, but which modern people would recognize as a hole in the ground with delusions of grandeur. These vegetables have spent the winter developing character, and by character, I mean they've achieved a texture somewhere between rubber and leather. Medieval root vegetables were hardy survivors that could theoretically remain edible for months, assuming your definition of edible was flexible enough to include won't immediately kill you. The largest of these survivors appears to be a turnip that's developed its own personality. Turnips were the backbone of medieval peasant nutrition, mainly because they would grow in soil that other plants considered uninhabitable. They were filling, stored reasonably well, and could be prepared in exactly one way: boiled until they achieved the consistency of medieval wallpaper paste. This particular turnip looks like it's been through several historical events and possibly a small war. Your cooking facilities consist of a single pot suspended over a fire pit that doubles as the room's heating system. Starting a fire in medieval times was a skill that separated the living from the frozen, requiring flint, steel, tinder, and the patience of someone who understood that central heating wouldn't be invented for several centuries. You strike flint against steel with the desperate enthusiasm of someone whose alternative is eating raw turnip, sending sparks flying toward a small pile of dried moss and wood shavings that you've been nurturing like a premature baby. Medieval tinder was precious beyond modern understanding. You collected it throughout the year-dried moss, birch bark, charred cloth, anything that would catch fire from a spark and stay lit long enough to ignite larger materials. Each piece represented potential warmth, cooked food, and the difference between survival and becoming another medieval mortality statistic. You guard your tinder collection like a dragon guards treasure, because in many ways, that's exactly what it is. After several minutes of striking sparks with the dedication of a medieval monk copying manuscripts, You achieve a small flame that immediately threatens to die out like your hopes for a warm breakfast. Medieval fires required constant attention and feeding, much like keeping an extremely temperamental pet alive. Too little fuel and it dies. Too much fuel and it smothers. Wrong type of fuel and it produces enough smoke to turn your hovel into a medieval gas chamber. You carefully nurture your flame with twigs, then larger sticks, building up to chunks of wood that you've been collecting whenever you could find them. Firewood was another precious resource in medieval times, leading to strict laws about what you could and couldn't gather from the Lord's forests. Taking a fallen branch might be acceptable. Cutting down a tree could result in punishments that made you nostalgic for simple starvation. The pot, once heated, receives your turnip and a small portion of the other root vegetables, along with enough water to create what medieval people called pottage, but what modern people would recognize as vegetable water with aspirations. Pottage was the foundation of medieval peasant nutrition, a thick soup that could be made from whatever ingredients were available and stretched to feed however many mouths needed feeding. Your pottage begins to bubble with the enthusiasm of a medieval witch's cauldron, filling your hovel with steam that carries the aroma of boiled vegetables and existential resignation. The smell isn't entirely unpleasant, it's more like what you'd get if you asked someone to describe food without ever having experienced flavor. Medieval cooking relied heavily on herbs and spices for taste, but peasants had access to only the most basic seasonings. Salt if you were lucky, whatever herbs grew wild in the area, and hope, salt, incidentally, was expensive enough that medieval people used it as currency, leading to phrases that are still common today. Being worth your salt meant you were valuable enough to justify the expense of paying you in this precious mineral. Your salt supply consists of a small chunk that you scrape sparingly into your pottage, knowing that when it's gone, your food will taste like medieval cardboard until you can afford more. While waiting for your breakfast to achieve edibility, you contemplate the nutritional reality of medieval peasant life. Your diet consists primarily of grains, vegetables, and the occasional bit of dairy or egg. Meat is a rare luxury. Fish depends on proximity to water and the Lord's permission to catch them, and fresh fruits are available only during their brief growing seasons. Malnutrition wasn't just common, it was the default state of existence. Medieval peasants were generally shorter than modern people, partly due to chronic malnutrition during crucial growth periods. Your breakfast pottage, while filling, provides carbohydrates and some vitamins but lacks many nutrients that modern nutritionists consider essential. Vitamin deficiencies led to diseases with names that sound like medieval curses. Scurvy, rickets, pellagra. These weren't exotic conditions, they were occupational hazards of peasant life. The pottage finally reaches a consistency that could generously be called edible, though chewable might be more accurate. You pour it into your wooden bowl, a vessel that's been carved by hand and shows the tool marks of its creation. Medieval peasant dishware was functional rather than decorative, designed to last for years of constant use and occasional use as emergency weapons. You sit on your single stola, three-legged piece of furniture that wobbles with the uncertainty of medieval engineering, and begin consuming your breakfast with the resigned determination of someone who understands that this is as good as food gets. The pottage tastes like boiled vegetables seasoned with resignation, but it's warm, it's filling, and it probably won't kill you, which in medieval terms makes it practically a feast. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants actually enjoyed their food or simply learned to suppress their gag reflexes out of survival necessity. But contemporary accounts suggest they found ways to appreciate what they had. After all, when your alternative is starvation, even turnip pottage starts to seem like a reasonable breakfast option. As you scrape the last of your meal from the bowl, you realize that this represents a significant portion of your daily caloric intake. Medieval peasants ate when food was available and went without when it wasn't, leading to feast or famine cycles that would horrify modern nutritionists. Some days you might have 3 meals. Other days you might have 1. During bad harvests, You might have whatever you could forage, beg, or trade for. The breakfast dishes require cleaning, which in medieval terms means rinsing with water and hoping for the best. Medieval dish soap was sand, ashes, or occasionally urine, depending on what was available and how desperate you were for cleanliness. Your wooden bowl gets a quick rinse in cold water before being set aside to air dry, ready for its next encounter with medieval cuisine. You've now consumed your first medieval meal, and while you're marginally less hungry, you're beginning to understand why medieval art depicts so many thin, gaunt faces. This wasn't artistic stylight, was documentary photography of people who considered successful weight management to be still breathing at the end of the day. The sun is finally beginning to rise properly, painting the sky in shades of gray that match your mood, and somewhere in the distance, you can hear the sound of other peasants beginning their daily labor. Your breakfast is finished, but your day of medieval agricultural hell is just beginning. The morning sun, pale and unconvincing like a medieval promise of better days ahead, signals the beginning of your agricultural death march. You step outside your hovel and immediately confront the medieval farmer's most reliable enemy, the weather. There's no Weather Channel app to warn you that today will bring the kind of rain that seems personally offended by your existence. No satellite imagery to suggest you might want to postpone heavy labor. Medieval weather forecasting consisted entirely of looking at the sky and muttering prayers to whatever saint supposedly handled atmospheric conditions. Your farming implements await you in what generously passes for a tool-sheeta lean-to structure that provides roughly the same protection from the elements as a particularly large leaf. These aren't the precision-engineered garden tools you might see at a modern home improvement store. These are medieval interpretations of what tools should theoretically accomplish, crafted by blacksmiths who understood that peasants couldn't afford quality and adjusted their standards accordingly. The centerpiece of your agricultural arsenal is a plow that looks like it was designed by someone who had heard plowing described secondhand but had never actually seen it done. Medieval plows came in two varieties: those that barely worked and those that didn't work at all. Yours falls somewhere in between, featuring a wooden moldboard that's been repaired so many times it's more repair than original plow, attached to a frame that creaks with the enthusiasm of a medieval torture device. Your ox, assuming you're fortunate enough to own one and haven't been reduced to pulling the plow yourself like some kind of agricultural pack animal, stands nearby with the expression of someone who's already having serious doubts about the day ahead. Medieval oxen were the tractors of their era, except tractors don't get sick, don't require feeding during famine years, and don't occasionally decide they'd rather be doing literally anything else. This particular ox, let's call him Despair, has the muscular build of an animal that spent its entire life pulling heavy things through hostile terrain, combined with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who's seen too many planting seasons. His harness is a masterpiece of medieval engineering, meaning it's held together with rope, leather scraps, and the kind of optimism that borders on delusion. You approach Despair with the cautious respect medieval farmers learned to show animals capable of trampling them into fertilizer. Harnessing an ox requires a delicate balance of authority and self-preservation, since these animals weigh approximately half a ton and have opinions about working conditions. Modern safety equipment consists of steel-toed boots and hard hats. Medieval safety equipment consists of staying alert and hoping for the best. The harness system looks like it was designed by committee, assuming the committee consisted entirely of people who had never seen a cow before. Leather straps connect to wooden yokes through a system of knots that would challenge a professional sailor, all held together by iron hardware forged by smiths who charged by the pound and economized accordingly. You begin the complex process of convincing several hundred pounds of livestock to accept a wooden yoke across their shoulders, a negotiation that requires diplomatic skills that would impress medieval ambassadors. Despair expresses his enthusiasm for the work ahead by attempting to step on your foot with hooves that could crush medieval armor. You dance around him with the agility of someone who understands that medieval healthcare consists primarily of don't get injured in the first place. The ox's cooperation is essential for your survival, since attempting to plow fields by hand would be roughly equivalent to trying to move mountains with a spoon. Your field stretches before you like a medieval punishment specifically designed to break human spirits. The soil, if you can call it that, consists primarily of clay, rocks, and whatever organic matter has been decomposing since the last ice age. Medieval fields weren't the rich, dark earth of modern agricultural photography. They were hostile environments that grudgingly produced crops only after being subjected to intensive medieval persuasion techniques. The field is divided into strips according to the open field system, a medieval agricultural arrangement that ensured everyone got an equal share of both good soil and terrible soil. Your strips are scattered across the village's arable land like a medieval jigsaw puzzle, guaranteeing that you'll spend as much time walking between plots as actually farming them. This system was designed by people who clearly believed that agricultural efficiency was less important than ensuring everyone suffered equally. You guide despair to the first strip, a narrow band of earth that looks like it's been through several natural disasters and possibly a small war. Medieval plowing wasn't the neat, straight furrows you might imagine from modern farming photos. It was more like controlled geological violence, with the plow attempting to break up soil that had achieved the consistency of medieval concrete. The plow's iron share, assuming it still qualifies as iron after years of contact with rocks that could double as medieval weapons, bites into the earth with all the effectiveness of trying to cut stone with a butter knife. Medieval soil wasn't prepared with modern fertilizers, and soil conditioner was whatever nature provided, modified slightly by centuries of adding whatever organic waste was available and hoping for improvements. You begin your first furrow with the optimism of someone who hasn't yet understood the true horror of medieval agriculture. The plow lurches forward like a drunk medieval knight, carving an uneven line through soil that seems personally offended by your attempts at cultivation. Rocks emerge from the earth like medieval landmines, each one requiring you to stop, clear the obstruction, and restart the process with slightly less enthusiasm than before. Despair plods forward with the resigned determination of an animal that's participated in this agricultural theater too many times to maintain any illusions about job satisfaction. His hooves sink into mud that has the consistency of medieval quicksand, making each step a minor victory against the forces of nature that seem aligned against agricultural success. The ox's breathing creates clouds of steam in the cold morning air, making him look like a medieval dragon with considerably less impressive career prospects. The plow's progress is measured in yards per hour rather than the acres per day that modern farming equipment achieves. Each furrow requires multiple passes, with rocks, roots, and other underground obstacles turning every step into a potential archaeological expedition. You uncover fragments of previous farming seasons' broken pottery, rusted metal, and occasionally items that suggest your field has served as a dumping ground for things people preferred to forget. Medieval farming was essentially a full-contact sport played against terrain that didn't want to be farmed, using equipment that barely qualified as functional, with livestock that had their own opinions about participation. Your muscles, accustomed to the gentle challenges of modern life, begin protesting in ways that suggest they're considering filing a formal complaint with whatever medieval authority handles workplace safety. The morning progresses with the slow inevitability of medieval siege warfare, each furrow a small victory won through persistent application of force against indifferent nature. Your hands, gripping the plow's wooden handles, develop blisters that burst and reform in a cycle that medieval farmers accepted as part of their job description. Medieval work gloves consisted of toughen up your hands until they developed their own leather coating, a process that took months and left permanent calluses that served as professional identification. Sweat begins to pour down your face despite the cold morning air, creating a salt sting that reminds you why medieval people considered bathing a suspicious luxury. The physical exertion required for plowing would challenge modern athletes, But medieval peasants performed this labor daily during planting season while maintaining whatever nutritional status they could achieve on turnip pottage and hope. The soil's resistance to improvement becomes increasingly obvious as you progress across the field. Medieval agriculture operated without the benefit of soil testing, pH balancing, or any understanding of the chemistry that makes modern farming possible. Farmers worked with whatever earth god provided and adjusted their expectations accordingly, leading to crop yields that would horrify modern agricultural scientists. Your first strip finally reaches completion after what feels like several historical epochs but registers as perhaps 2 hours of actual time. The furrows behind you look like they were carved by someone having an argument with the earth itself, uneven, wandering, and interrupted by obstacles that turned plowing into a medieval obstacle course. But they're furrows, which in medieval terms represents significant progress toward the theoretical possibility of growing something edible. Despair stands at the end of the strip with the patient resignation of an animal that understands there are many more strips to go. His sides heave with the effort of pulling medieval farming equipment through hostile terrain, and steam rises from his body like incense from a particularly strenuous religious ceremony. The ox's cooperation has been essential, but you're beginning to understand why medieval farmers developed such intimate relationships with their livestock. When your survival depends on an animal's willingness to work, that animal becomes more valuable than most human relationships. The sun has climbed higher in the sky, providing slightly more light but no additional warmth to speak of. Medieval mornings were cold regardless of season, partly due to the general climate and partly due to the lack of any effective heating systems beyond stand near a fire and hope nothing catches on fire accidentally. Your breath still creates visible clouds as you contemplate the remaining strips that stretch before you like a medieval endurance test designed by particularly creative torturers. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants found satisfaction in their agricultural labor or simply developed psychological coping mechanisms that allowed them to continue functioning despite daily exposure to experiences that would break most modern people. The evidence suggests they took pride in successful harvests and felt genuine accomplishment when their efforts produced food, but they also understood that farming was fundamentally a battle against forces that wanted them to fail. You've completed one strip out of several dozen that require attention before the planting season ends and winter returns to make everything exponentially more difficult. Your body is already sending signals that suggest it wasn't designed for this type of continuous physical labor. But medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of rest days or ergonomic equipment. They worked when work needed doing and recovered when they could, leading to life expectancies that would concern modern insurance companies. The medieval farming day has barely begun, but you're already understanding why contemporary artwork depicts so many peasants with expressions that suggest they're questioning their career choices. Your agricultural torture session gets temporarily interrupted by sounds that suggest your livestock have decided to stage their own medieval rebellion. From the general direction of what optimistically passes for your barnyard comes a symphony of animal discontent squealing, clucking, mooing, and other noises that indicate your farming partners have grievances to air. Medieval animals weren't the docile, well-behaved creatures of modern petting zoos. They were survivors of a world where everything from wolves to harsh winters to periodic famines tried to kill them, and they developed personalities to match. You reluctantly abandon your plow and trudge toward the source of the commotion, your boots squelching through mud that has achieved the consistency of medieval cement mixer. The barnyard reveals itself to be less organized animal husbandry facility and more barely controlled chaos with occasional livestock. Medieval farmers didn't have the luxury of modern veterinary care, proper animal nutrition, or facilities designed by people who understood animal behavior. They had whatever shelter they could build and whatever animals they could keep alive long enough to be useful. Your pig pen contains 3 specimens that look like they've been designed by committee, assuming the committee consisted entirely of people who had never seen a pig but had heard them described by someone with a grudge against barnyard animals. Medieval pigs weren't the pink, plump creatures of modern farms. They were lean, aggressive foraging machines that could survive on whatever organic matter they could find, including things you'd prefer not to think about. The largest pig, who you've mentally named Chaos, has somehow managed to escape the pen and is now engaged in what can only be described as agricultural terrorism. Medieval pig pens were constructed from whatever materials were available, held together by hope and the occasional prayer to Saint Anthony, the patron saint of finding lost things, which included escaped livestock. Chaos has discovered that your vegetable storage area makes an excellent all-you-can-eat buffet and is systematically destroying several months' worth of carefully hoarded root vegetables. Medieval pigs were essentially four-legged garbage disposals with attitude problems. They ate kitchen scraps, fallen fruit, whatever they could forage in the woods, and occasionally small animals that wandered too close to their territory. They were valuable for their ability to convert organic waste into protein, but they were also notorious escape artists who treated property boundaries as suggestions rather than actual barriers. You approach chaos with the careful respect medieval farmers learned to show animals that outweighed them and had tusks. Medieval pig handling techniques relied heavily on bribery, threats, and occasionally just accepting that pigs would do whatever they wanted and adjusting your plans accordingly. Chaos looks up from his vegetable destruction project with the expression of someone who's been caught committing crimes but has no intention of stopping. The pig pen itself tells a story of medieval engineering optimism clashing with animal cunning. The fence consists of wooden stakes driven into the ground and connected by whatever materials were available: rope, leather strips, more wood, and what appears to be optimism made manifest. Medieval fencing was designed to keep animals contained while using the minimum amount of expensive materials, leading to barriers that worked perfectly right up until they didn't. Your other pigs, apparently inspired by Chaos's jailbreak, have decided that their pen represents an unreasonable restriction on their freedom of movement. They're testing every section of fence with the systematic determination of medieval siege engineers, looking for weaknesses they can exploit to join their colleagues' vegetable rampage. Medieval pigs were intelligent enough to solve problems and remember solutions, making them formidable opponents in the ongoing battle between farmers and livestock. You attempt to lure Chaos back toward captivity using a combination of food bribes and verbal threats that would be impressive if pigs understood medieval English. The pig considers your offers with the calculating expression of someone evaluating a business proposal and finding it inadequate. Medieval animal psychology was poorly understood, leading to training techniques that relied heavily on trial and error, with emphasis on the error part. Meanwhile, your chicken situation has deteriorated into what medieval people would have recognized as poultry warfare. Medieval chickens weren't the plump, docile birds of modern farms. They were lean, aggressive descendants of jungle fowl who retained most of their wild instincts along with a few new ones developed specifically to torment farmers. They could fly well enough to escape most enclosures, fought like feathered gladiators, and laid eggs with the enthusiasm of creatures who understood that reproduction was optional. Your rooster, the previously mentioned bloodbeak, has apparently decided that your morning plowing constituted an invasion of his territory and is now launching aerial assaults with the dedication of a medieval knight defending his honor. Medieval roosters were territorial to the point of psychosis, treating everything within their domain as potential threats that required aggressive responses. Bloodbeak approaches you with his neck feathers raised and his spurs ready for combat, looking like a miniature dinosaur with anger management issues. The hens, meanwhile, have discovered that your freshly plowed furrows make excellent dust baths, and they're systematically undoing hours of agricultural labor by wallowing in the dirt you've carefully turned. Medieval chickens were excellent at finding the most inconvenient ways to be helpful, turning every farming task into a collaborative effort where the collaboration was entirely unwelcome. You wave your arms at the chickens with the authority of someone who's already lost this battle but hasn't admitted it yet. Medieval chicken management required constant vigilance and the acceptance that poultry would always find ways to make your life more difficult. The hens regard your gestures with the indifference of creatures who know they can fly and you can't, continuing their dust bath project with the satisfaction of animals who understand they hold the tactical advantage. Your cow, a medieval dairy machine named something like Desperation, stands in what passes for a pasture and regards the general chaos with bovine stoicism. Medieval cows were smaller than modern dairy breeds, hardier, and produced less milk, but they could survive on rougher pasture and required less intensive care. Desperation has the lean build of an animal that's learned to make the most of whatever food is available, combined with the patient expression of someone who's witnessed many farming disasters and expects to see many more. The cow's shelter consists of a three-sided structure that provides protection from wind in at least one direction, assuming the wind cooperates by blowing from the correct angle. Medieval cattle housing was designed according to the principle that cows were tougher than humans and could therefore survive conditions that would challenge most contemporary livestock. Desperation's accommodations would horrify modern animal welfare inspectors, but they represent the best that medieval economic realities could provide. Milking, when it happens, requires a delicate negotiation between human needs and bovine cooperation. Medieval cows weren't bred for docility, and milking was often a contact sport that required good reflexes and a willingness to accept that sometimes the cow won. Desperation produces perhaps a gallon of milk daily when she's feeling cooperative. But medieval cows weren't reliable machines, they were biological systems subject to seasonal variations, health issues, and personal moods. Your sheep, assuming you're prosperous enough to own any, represent the medieval equivalent of a savings account with legs. Medieval sheep were smaller than modern breeds, producing less wool but requiring minimal care and able to survive on marginal pasture that wouldn't support other livestock. They were walking bank accounts that produced wool, meat, and occasionally new sheep, making them valuable enough that losing one to wolves or thieves represented a genuine financial disaster. The sheep pen, like everything else in your medieval agricultural empire, operates on the principle that adequate is better than perfect and perfect is financially impossible anyway. Medieval sheep fencing required balancing the cost of materials against the sheep's ability to escape, leading to compromises that worked most of the time and failed at the most inconvenient possible moments. Your sheep have developed the nervous alertness of animals that understand they live in a world full of predators. Medieval wolves, bears, and human thieves all considered sheep to be convenient sources of protein, leading to livestock that spent their days scanning the horizon for threats and their nights huddled together for mutual protection. Sheep guarding was a serious responsibility that required constant vigilance and occasionally resulted in dramatic confrontations with wildlife that had different ideas about property ownership. The morning's livestock management crisis continues to unfold with the inexorable progression of a medieval natural disaster. Chaos the pig has moved from vegetable destruction to exploring your grain storage, a development that threatens to turn a minor agricultural setback into a genuine survival crisis. Medieval grain storage required protecting precious food supplies from weather, rodents, and apparently escaped pigs with ambitious dietary goals. You attempt to corner chaos using techniques developed through generations of medieval pig wrangling experience, which primarily consist of trying to think like a pig while maintaining enough human dignity to avoid crawling around on all fours. The pig evaluates your herding attempts with the critical eye of someone who's studied human behavior and found it predictable, continuing his agricultural rampage while staying just out of reach. The other animals watch this performance with the detached interest of spectators at medieval entertainment, occasionally contributing their own chaos to ensure the situation doesn't become too manageable. Medieval farms were essentially barely controlled biological systems where every animal had its own agenda and none of those agendas aligned perfectly with human farming objectives. Historians still argue whether medieval farmers genuinely loved their animals or simply developed Stockholm Syndrome after years of daily interaction with creatures that seemed determined to make agriculture as difficult as possible. The evidence suggests they appreciated animals that pulled their weight and harbored grudges against those that didn't. leading to relationships that combined practical necessity with genuine affection and occasional homicidal fantasies. You finally managed to convince Chaos that returning to his pen might be in his best interests, using a combination of food bribes and implied threats about bacon futures. The pig considers your negotiating position and apparently decides that temporary cooperation might be the wise choice, allowing you to guide him back toward captivity with the satisfied expression of someone who's won a tactical victory while losing the strategic war. Your morning livestock management session has consumed hours that could have been spent on other agricultural disasters, but medieval farming required dealing with problems in order of immediate urgency rather than long-term efficiency. Animals that escaped their pens represented immediate crises that took priority over everything else, including the field work that was supposedly the day's primary objective. The sun continues its journey across the sky with the relentless progression of medieval time, where daylight was precious and wasting it meant working into the evening by firelight or accepting that tasks would remain unfinished. Your livestock are temporarily contained, but you're beginning to understand why medieval farmers developed the patient resignation of people who knew that every day brought new challenges specifically designed to test their will to live. Just as you're beginning to think you might have achieved some semblance of control over your medieval agricultural nightmare, the sky decides to demonstrate why medieval farmers developed such intimate relationships with whatever deities supposedly controlled weather patterns. Dark clouds have been gathering with the ominous efficiency of a medieval siege army, and now they're preparing to unleash the kind of precipitation that turns farming from merely difficult to practically impossible. Medieval weather forecasting consisted entirely of looking at the sky and making educated guesses based on whatever folk wisdom had survived previous meteorological disasters. There were no satellite images, no radar systems, no friendly meteorologists explaining low-pressure systems, just you, the sky, and whatever atmospheric violence nature felt like delivering. The approaching storm clouds have the distinctive color of medieval misery, that particular shade of gray-black that suggests the weather is taking this personally. Your clothing, already inadequate for normal medieval farming conditions, now faces its ultimate test against precipitation that seems designed specifically to penetrate every fiber and reach your skin with maximum efficiency. Medieval peasant clothing was constructed from wool that had been processed using techniques that prioritized economy over water resistance, creating garments that absorbed moisture like medieval sponges while providing roughly the same protection from rain as wearing a fishnet. The first drops hit with the aggressive enthusiasm of medieval warfare, each one finding its way through your clothing's defenses with surgical precision. Medieval rain wasn't the gentle precipitation you might experience in a modern climate-controlled world. It was atmospheric warfare conducted by clouds that seemed personally offended by human attempts at agriculture. The drops are cold enough to make you question your ancestors' decision to leave whatever warm caves they might have been occupying before someone invented farming. Your hat, crafted from felt that's been compressed using medieval techniques that emphasize durability over water resistance, immediately begins absorbing rainfall like a medieval irrigation system designed by someone who didn't understand the concept. Medieval headwear was designed to provide some protection from sun and light rain, but serious precipitation turned most hats into soggy fashion disasters that channeled water directly onto your neck and shoulders. The rain intensifies with the methodical efficiency of a medieval siege engine, progressing from light sprinkle to moderate inconvenience to atmospheric punishment in the space of minutes. Your freshly plowed furrows begin filling with water that turns the carefully turned soil into a substance that combines the worst properties of mud and quicksand. Medieval drainage systems consisted primarily of hope the water goes somewhere else, leading to fields that became temporary lakes whenever the weather turned uncooperative. Despair the ox expresses his opinion of working in rain by adopting the body language of an animal that's seriously reconsidering his career choices. Medieval livestock didn't have the luxury of indoor work environments or weather delays. They worked in whatever conditions nature provided, but that didn't mean they had to be happy about it. The ox's coat darkens as it absorbs rainwater, making him look like a medieval sponge with legs and attitude problems. Your wool tunic, meanwhile, has begun the process of transforming from clothing to wearable swamp. Medieval wool contained natural oils that provided some water resistance, but continuous exposure to medieval precipitation eventually overwhelmed these defenses, leading to garments that weighed approximately twice their dry weight and had the breathability of medieval chainmail. You're essentially wearing a portable sauna that traps your body heat while simultaneously conducting rainwater directly to your skin. The mud situation deteriorates rapidly from agricultural challenge to geological disaster. Medieval soil, lacking modern drainage improvements and soil conditioning treatments, responded to heavy rain by transforming into a substance that combined the adhesive properties of medieval glue with the consistency of wet concrete. Each step requires the kind of effort usually reserved for medieval siege warfare, as your feet sink into earth that seems determined to claim your shoes as permanent residence. Your boots, constructed using leatherworking techniques that emphasized longevity over waterproofing, begin admitting water through seams that were sealed using medieval methods that worked perfectly right up until they encountered serious moisture. Medieval leather could theoretically resist light rain, but sustained exposure to precipitation turned most footwear into wearable aquariums that squished with every step. The wind picks up with the enthusiasm of a medieval army advancing on an undefended village, driving rain horizontally instead of vertically and ensuring that no part of your body remains dry regardless of how you position yourself relative to the storm. Medieval wind was an equal opportunity tormentor that found every gap in your clothing and exploited it with the efficiency of experienced siege engineers. Your field work becomes exponentially more difficult as the rain transforms already challenging agricultural conditions into something that resembles medieval warfare conducted in a swamp. The plow, designed for relatively firm soil conditions, begins behaving like a boat attempting to navigate through liquid earth. Despair struggles to maintain footing on ground that's achieved the consistency of medieval quicksand, each step a minor victory against terrain that seems actively hostile to agricultural success. Visibility drops to medieval standards, which means you can see clearly enough to identify immediate obstacles but not far enough to plan more than a few steps ahead. Medieval farmers worked by line-of-sight navigation during good weather and educated guesswork during storms, leading to agricultural patterns that sometimes resembled the work of people who'd been farming while blindfolded. The rain finds every weakness in your shelter systems with the thoroughness of medieval tax collectors identifying sources of revenue. Water begins dripping through your hovel's thatched roof at multiple points, creating an indoor precipitation system that turns your living space into a medieval water feature. Medieval roofing was designed to shed most water most of the time, but sustained rainfall eventually overwhelmed even well-maintained thatch, leading to homes that featured their own private weather systems. Your livestock express their dissatisfaction with outdoor working conditions by seeking whatever shelter they can find, which in medieval terms usually means the least exposed corner of whatever inadequate structure serves as their housing. Animals have better sense than humans about when weather makes outdoor activity dangerous, but medieval farming schedules didn't accommodate meteorological preferences. The storm shows no signs of abating with the polite consideration you might expect from modern weather systems that wrap up their business efficiently and move on. Medieval storms operated on their own schedules, often settling in for extended visits that could last days or even weeks, transforming entire regions into soggy medieval disasters that challenged human survival capabilities. You attempt to continue working despite conditions that would shut down most modern outdoor activities, because medieval farmers didn't have the luxury of weather days or indoor alternatives. The growing season was finite, and losing days to rain meant either working in impossible conditions or accepting reduced harvests that could mean the difference between survival and starvation during the following winter. The physical discomfort reaches levels that would impress medieval torture specialists. Your wet clothing conducts heat away from your body with the efficiency of a medieval refrigeration system, while simultaneously restricting your movement and adding extra weight that makes every agricultural task exponentially more difficult. Medieval peasants developed the kind of cold tolerance that would amaze modern outdoor enthusiasts but they did it through necessity rather than recreational choice. Your hands, gripping wet wooden tool handles, develop the wrinkled appearance of medieval laundry that's been soaking too long, while losing the dexterity necessary for fine motor control. Medieval farming tools weren't designed with ergonomic considerations or grip-enhancing materials. They were carved from whatever wood was available and expected to function regardless of weather conditions. The mud clings to everything with the persistence of medieval bureaucrats pursuing unpaid taxes. Your tools accumulate layers of earth that transform their shapes and weights, turning familiar implements into medieval sculpture projects that bear only passing resemblance to their original forms. Cleaning tools required time and effort that medieval farmers couldn't spare during active growing seasons. Historians still argue whether medieval farmers developed genuine appreciation for working in adverse weather conditions or simply learned to suppress their survival instincts long enough to complete essential tasks. The evidence suggests they found ways to cope with conditions that would challenge modern survival experts. But they also understood that agricultural success often depended on working through circumstances that made farming practically impossible. The storm continues its medieval assault on human agricultural ambitions with the relentless determination of natural forces that don't particularly care about human survival needs. You're beginning to understand why medieval people attributed weather patterns to divine intervention or supernatural influences. When your survival depends on atmospheric cooperation, and the atmosphere seems actively hostile, supernatural explanations start seeming reasonable. Your day has transformed from merely difficult agricultural labor to an endurance test that challenges both physical capabilities and mental resilience. Medieval farming wasn't just about growing crops, it was about maintaining the will to continue despite daily encounters with conditions designed to break human spirits and bodies. The rain shows no mercy, and neither does your medieval reality. By the time the sun reaches its medieval approximation of noon, which you can only estimate since sundials don't work during rainstorms and mechanical clocks won't be invented for several centuries, your body begins sending urgent messages about the need for sustenance. Medieval mealtimes weren't governed by convenient scheduling or balanced nutrition plans. They were dictated by whatever food was available and whenever you could stop working long enough to consume it without dying of exposure. You slosh through ankle-deep mud toward your hovel, each step requiring the kind of effort usually associated with medieval siege warfare. Your boots have achieved the consistency of wearable swamps, squishing with every movement and adding several pounds of accumulated earth to your already challenging mobility situation. Medieval footwear wasn't designed for extended exposure to liquid terrain, leading to boots that became more like portable mud sculptures with each passing hour. Inside your architectural masterpiece, the indoor rain situation has progressed from minor inconvenience to competing weather system. Water drips through your thatched roof at strategic intervals, creating a percussion section that would impress medieval musicians if medieval musicians had time to appreciate ambient home acoustics while struggling to survive. Your single room now features multiple climate zones, ranging from merely damp to basically underwater. Your food storage area has been conducting its own experiment in medieval water management, with mixed results that would concern modern food safety inspectors. The wooden box containing your bread collection has developed its own microclimate, complete with humidity levels that transform stale bread into something approaching medieval wallpaper paste. Your provisions are engaging in biological processes that would fascinate contemporary scientists studying decomposition rates in controlled moisture environments. The bread situation has evolved beyond mere staleness into what medieval people would have recognized as an advanced state of fermentation. Your loaves have achieved the consistency of medieval sponges, absorbing ambient moisture until they resemble soggy medieval masonry rather than anything intended for human consumption. Medieval bread preservation techniques worked adequately during dry weather but failed spectacularly when exposed to the kind of atmospheric moisture you're currently experiencing. You extract what remains of your cheese supply from its storage location, discovering that it has developed new characteristics that would challenge even medieval standards of food acceptability. The cheese now features a surface texture reminiscent of medieval leather that's been left outside during multiple rainstorms, combined with an aroma that suggests it's conducting its own biological experiments in real time. Your ale supply, stored in a clay vessel that was crafted by medieval potters working under the economic philosophy of adequate is better than expensive, has maintained its liquid status but developed sediment layers that tell the geological story of your brewing attempts. Medieval ale wasn't filtered using modern techniques, leading to beverages that contained whatever particulate matter was present during the fermentation process, plus anything that fell into the container afterward. The cooking situation presents challenges that would stump medieval siege engineers. Your fire pit has been conducting its own battle against atmospheric moisture, with the fire losing badly to precipitation that finds its way down through roof leaks and smoke holes. Medieval fire management in wet weather required skills that combined meteorology, engineering, and the kind of optimism usually associated with people who voluntarily chose careers in agriculture. You attempt to resurrect your cooking fire using techniques developed through generations of medieval experience with uncooperative combustion systems. This involves carefully arranging increasingly damp kindling around embers that may or may not still contain enough heat to ignite anything, while simultaneously trying to shield the operation from water drops that seem specifically targeted at extinguishing any potential flames. Medieval fire starting in wet conditions was essentially a negotiation between human determination and physical laws that didn't particularly care about human nutritional needs. You strike flint against steel with the desperation of someone who understands that cold food in cold weather represents a survival challenge that medieval people took seriously. Sparks fly with the enthusiasm of medieval fireworks, landing on tinder that's absorbed enough atmospheric moisture to qualify as a small wetland. After considerable effort that would impress medieval monks copying manuscripts by candlelight, you achieve a small flame that immediately begins its own battle against environmental conditions designed to extinguish it. Medieval fires were temperamental systems that required constant attention and feeding, much like maintaining extremely high-maintenance pets that could kill you if they stopped working properly. Your cooking pot, retrieved from its storage location and cleaned using medieval techniques that prioritize speed over sanitation, receives whatever food items remain edible enough to justify the risk of consumption. This creates what medieval people optimistically called pottage, but what contemporary nutritionists would probably classify as experimental biology with minimal nutritional value. The soup that results from your culinary efforts combines the robust flavors of soggy bread, questionable cheese, and whatever herbs you can forage from plants that haven't been completely destroyed by the ongoing atmospheric assault. Medieval seasoning relied heavily on wild plants that grew despite rather than because of human agricultural efforts, leading to flavor combinations that would challenge modern taste preferences. You ladle this medieval masterpiece into your wooden bowl, noting that the vessel has absorbed enough moisture from the ambient humidity to develop its own unique texture and aroma. Medieval dishware was essentially single-use items that lasted for years, accumulating character and biological diversity with each meal until they achieved the status of small ecosystems. The first spoonful delivers flavors that combine the earthy richness of wet soil with hints of fermentation and the distinctive taste of food that's been stored under conditions that would challenge modern preservation techniques. Medieval peasants developed palates that could appreciate subtle flavor variations in foods that modern people would classify as probably not safe for human consumption. Your dining experience is enhanced by the ambient sound effects of rain drumming on your roof with the persistence of medieval siege engines attacking castle walls. The acoustic environment creates a dining atmosphere that combines the charm of eating inside a drum during a percussion concert with the visual appeal of consuming soup while water drips steadily into various containers placed strategically around your living space. Medieval mealtimes weren't the social occasions depicted in modern historical dramas. They were survival exercises conducted under whatever conditions prevailed, with whatever food was available, using whatever implements remained functional. Your solo lunch represents a typical medieval dining experience. Challenging, nutritionally questionable, and conducted under circumstances that would discourage most contemporary food critics. The warmth from your soup provides temporary relief from the comprehensive cold that's been seeping into your bones since the rain began its medieval assault on human agricultural ambitions. Medieval heating consisted primarily of internal heat generation through consumption of hot food and whatever radiant warmth could be captured from cooking fires, leading to survival strategies that required constant attention to maintaining core body temperature. Your afternoon meal concludes with the satisfied resignation of someone who's successfully consumed calories under circumstances that challenged both culinary standards and basic food safety principles. Medieval peasants measured meal success not by flavor or presentation, but by the simple fact that food had been consumed and no immediate adverse effects were apparent. The remaining daylight hours stretch before you like a medieval endurance test specifically designed to evaluate human persistence under conditions that most contemporary people would consider grounds for calling in sick to work. But medieval farmers didn't have sick days, vacation time, or indoor alternatives. They had whatever daylight remained and whatever physical capabilities they could muster to make use of it. Your lunch dishes require cleaning using medieval techniques that consisted of rinsing with cold water and hoping that mechanical action would remove whatever organic matter had accumulated during the meal. Medieval dish soap was whatever abrasive materials were available: sand, ashes, or occasionally small stones applied with enough force to achieve cleanliness without destroying the dishware entirely. The rain continues its medieval performance with the dedication of natural forces that don't operate according to human convenience schedules. Your afternoon work awaits, but the weather has transformed even simple agricultural tasks into survival challenges that would impress medieval adventure writers if medieval adventure writers had existed and had time to write about agricultural disasters. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants developed genuine resilience or simply learned to function while completely miserable, but contemporary accounts suggest they found ways to maintain productivity under conditions that would shut down most modern outdoor activities. Your medieval lunch has provided temporary sustenance, but the day's agricultural battles are far from over. You've successfully navigated medieval mealtime during adverse weather conditions, an achievement that represents genuine survival skills rather than mere inconvenience. The afternoon's work awaits with the patient inevitability of natural forces that don't particularly care about human comfort preferences. The afternoon's agricultural torment begins with the sobering realization that your morning's plowing progress has been systematically undone by weather conditions that seem personally invested in your failure. Your carefully turned furrows have transformed into miniature medieval canals, complete with water features that would be charming if they weren't representing the destruction of hours of backbreaking labor. Medieval drainage engineering consisted primarily of hoping water would flow downhill and away from important areas, a strategy that worked perfectly except when it didn't. You squelch back toward the fields with the resigned determination of someone who's beginning to understand why medieval agricultural documents contain so many references to divine intervention and supernatural assistance. Your boots have now accumulated enough mud to qualify as geological formations, each step requiring the kind of effort usually associated with medieval siege engines attempting to breach castle walls. The additional weight makes walking feel like wearing medieval armor designed by someone who hated mobility. Despair the ox stands in what was previously your barnyard, but now resembles a medieval swamp, expressing his professional opinion of continued outdoor work through body language that would be clearly understood by modern labor union representatives. Medieval livestock weren't consulted about working conditions, but they developed effective methods of nonverbal communication that left little doubt about their preferences regarding weather-related work assignments. Your agricultural tools have undergone their own transformation during the morning's meteorological assault. The plow, previously a marginally functional piece of medieval engineering, now sports enough accumulated earth to qualify as a mobile garden installation. Medieval tool maintenance consisted primarily of scraping off whatever organic matter had attached itself during use and hoping the underlying implement remained structurally sound enough for continued service. The process of clearing mud from your equipment requires techniques that combine medieval engineering principles with the kind of patience usually associated with monks illuminating manuscripts. Each tool must be individually restored to functional status using whatever scraping implements are available, a process that removes layers of accumulated earth while hopefully preserving the underlying wood and iron components that make the tools theoretically useful. Your hands, already challenged by morning exposure to medieval weather conditions, now face the additional stress of handling wet wooden implements that have absorbed enough moisture to develop the grip characteristics of medieval soap. Medieval work gloves consisted of developing calluses thick enough to provide natural protection, a process that took months and left permanent modifications to your hand structure that served as occupational identification. The field conditions have evolved from merely challenging to actively hostile toward human agricultural ambitions. Your strips of arable land now feature their own water management systems, with drainage patterns that follow geological principles rather than human farming preferences. Medieval field drainage was an ongoing negotiation between human engineering efforts and natural water flow patterns that didn't particularly care about agricultural success. You attempt to resume plowing using techniques developed through generations of medieval farmers working under less than optimal conditions. This requires convincing despair that continuing to work in conditions that challenge basic animal survival instincts represents a reasonable career choice, a negotiation that involves both food bribes and implied threats about winter feeding schedules. The ox's cooperation is essential for any hope of agricultural progress, since attempting to plow waterlogged medieval fields by human power alone would be roughly equivalent to trying to move mountains using medieval hand tools. Despair considers your proposal with the calculating expression of an animal that's evaluating risk versus reward ratios and finding the mathematics discouraging. Medieval oxen were intelligent enough to understand when working conditions exceeded reasonable safety parameters, but they were also dependent on human feeding schedules for survival, creating economic relationships that occasionally overrode their better judgment. Despair eventually agrees to continue working, but his body language suggests he's filing this decision under regrettable career choices forced by economic necessity. Your first attempt at continuing the plowing process reveals that medieval agriculture in wet conditions was essentially a form of aquatic excavation conducted with land-based equipment. The plow disappears into mud with the efficiency of a medieval siege engine sinking into a moat, requiring extraction efforts that challenge both human and bovine engineering capabilities. Each furrow becomes an individual engineering project requiring careful planning, sustained effort, and the kind of optimism usually associated with people who voluntarily choose careers that involve daily battles against hostile natural forces. The soil resists improvement with the determination of medieval castle walls withstanding siege attacks, yielding only after sustained application of force that leaves both human and animal participants questioning their life choices. Your progress across the field is measured in yards per hour rather than the acres per day that medieval agricultural schedules theoretically required. Each step forward represents a minor victory won through persistent application of medieval engineering principles to problems that seemed specifically designed to challenge human agricultural ambitions. The furrows behind you look like they were carved by people conducting geological research using farming equipment. The physical demands of plowing waterlogged fields would challenge modern athletes equipped with contemporary training programs and nutritional supplements. Medieval peasants accomplished this labor while maintaining whatever fitness levels they could achieve on diets consisting primarily of grain, vegetables, and hope. Your muscles are discovering previously unknown capabilities for pain generation, sending messages that suggest they weren't designed for this type of sustained mechanical stress. Medieval farming was essentially a full-contact sport played against terrain that didn't want to be farmed, using equipment that barely qualified as functional, in weather conditions that challenged human survival capabilities. Your afternoon agricultural session represents a typical medieval work experience. Physically demanding, technologically challenging, and conducted under circumstances that would violate most contemporary workplace safety regulations. The rain continues its medieval performance with the consistency of natural forces that operate according to atmospheric physics rather than human convenience preferences. Your clothing has achieved complete saturation, transforming from protective garments into wearable water storage systems that conduct heat away from your body with the efficiency of medieval refrigeration technology. Sweat and rainwater combined to create a comprehensive moisture management challenge that medieval textile technology wasn't designed to address. Your wool clothing, theoretically capable of maintaining some insulating properties even when wet, has reached the saturation point where it provides roughly the same thermal protection as wearing a medieval fishing net in a blizzard. The afternoon light, such as it is, begins its gradual retreat toward evening with the inexorable progression of medieval time measurement systems that didn't accommodate weather delays or human preference schedules. Medieval daylight was a finite resource that couldn't be saved, stored, or extended, requiring farmers to accomplish whatever work was possible during whatever illumination nature provided. Your field work continues with the mechanical persistence of medieval siege operations, where success depended more on sustained effort than on sophisticated strategy. Each furrow represents progress toward theoretical agricultural success, but the cumulative physical cost is beginning to approach levels that would concern medieval physicians if medieval physicians existed and had time to evaluate occupational health hazards. The ox expresses increasing skepticism about continued outdoor labor through behavioral modifications that include strategic non-cooperation and what appears to be passive resistance to further agricultural advancement. Medieval animal psychology was poorly understood, but farmers learned to recognize when livestock reached the limits of their willingness to participate in human agricultural projects. Your tools require constant maintenance to remain functional under conditions that challenge even medieval engineering standards for durability. The wooden handles absorb moisture until they develop the structural integrity of medieval sponges, while the iron components accumulate earth deposits that modify their shapes and effectiveness. Medieval tool replacement was expensive enough that farmers learned to coax continued service from implements that modern standards would classify as beyond repair. The afternoon's agricultural battle continues with the relentless determination of medieval siege warfare, where victory went to whichever side could maintain operations longer under increasingly difficult conditions. You're beginning to understand why medieval agricultural documents contain so many references to divine assistance and supernatural intervention, when your survival depends on successful farming under conditions that seem designed to prevent agricultural success. Supernatural explanations start seeming entirely reasonable. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants genuinely enjoyed their agricultural work or simply developed psychological coping mechanisms that allowed them to function despite daily exposure to conditions that would challenge modern survival experts. The evidence suggests they found ways to maintain productivity and even take pride in successful harvests. But they also understood that farming was fundamentally a battle against natural forces that seemed personally invested in human failure. Your medieval afternoon agricultural session represents a typical medieval work experience, demonstrating why medieval farmers developed the kind of physical resilience and mental toughness that would impress contemporary endurance athletes. The day isn't over yet, but you're already understanding why medieval people had such short life expectancies and such grim expressions in period artwork. As the afternoon light begins its medieval retreat toward what passes for evening in your agricultural nightmare, the realization dawns that surviving the day's farming disasters was only the first act in a much longer medieval performance. Evening in peasant life wasn't about relaxation or entertainment, it was about conducting emergency repairs on everything that had broken during the day's agricultural warfare, while simultaneously preparing for tomorrow's inevitable disasters. Your tools, having survived their afternoon battle against hostile terrain and adverse weather conditions, now require the kind of intensive care usually reserved for medieval battle casualties. The plow, which began the day as a marginally functional piece of agricultural equipment, has been transformed into what could charitably be described as abstract sculpture covered in geological samples. Medieval tool maintenance was essential for survival, since replacing implements required either money you didn't have or blacksmithing skills you probably hadn't developed. You begin the delicate process of cleaning your equipment using techniques that combine medieval engineering principles with the kind of patience typically associated with religious devotion. Each tool must be individually restored to theoretical functionality through careful removal of accumulated earth, followed by inspection for structural damage that might compromise future agricultural operations. Medieval farmers became expert mechanics through necessity, developing diagnostic skills that would impress modern equipment technicians. The wooden handles of your implements have absorbed enough moisture to qualify as small wetland ecosystems, requiring careful drying procedures that balance speed against the risk of cracking or warping. Medieval wood preservation relied on gradual moisture removal and occasional application of whatever oils or fats were available, creating maintenance routines that resembled religious rituals in their attention to detail and repetitive nature. Your clothing situation has progressed beyond mere dampness into what contemporary textile experts would classify as a complete system failure. Medieval wool, while theoretically capable of providing insulation even when wet, has reached saturation levels where it functions more like wearable refrigeration equipment than protective garments. The process of achieving any degree of dryness requires strategic positioning near your fire while avoiding actual combustion of your only outfit. The fire itself presents maintenance challenges that would stump modern heating engineers. Medieval fires required constant feeding, careful adjustment of airflow, and the kind of attention usually reserved for extremely high-maintenance pets that could kill you if they stopped functioning properly. Your evening fire management involves balancing fuel conservation against heat production while maintaining enough flame to support cooking operations and equipment drying. Your hovel's interior has developed its own microclimate system featuring multiple precipitation zones, temperature gradients, and humidity levels that would fascinate meteorologists studying indoor weather patterns. The roof leaks have established regular drip schedules that require strategic placement of containers to prevent your living space from transforming into a medieval indoor swimming pool. Livestock management presents evening challenges that combine veterinary medicine with animal psychology, assuming you had access to either medieval veterinarians or animal psychologists. Your animals have survived the day's weather assault, but they require inspection for injuries, feeding despite limited food supplies, and housing in structures that provide minimal protection from continued atmospheric hostility. To spare the ox stands in what was previously a barnyard but now resembles a medieval marsh, requiring evaluation for hoof problems, harness injuries, and the kind of attitude adjustments that might be necessary if tomorrow's agricultural operations are to have any hope of success. Medieval ox care relied heavily on visual inspection and hands-on assessment, since animals couldn't articulate their health concerns in ways that medieval farmers could understand. Your pigs have used the day's chaos as an opportunity to further express their opinions about property boundaries and human authority, requiring diplomatic negotiations that balance their natural tendencies toward agricultural terrorism with your need to maintain some semblance of farming operations. Medieval pig management was essentially ongoing psychological warfare conducted between species with different definitions of appropriate behavior. The chickens have achieved new levels of creative destruction, turning your freshly worked fields into recreational facilities for dust bathing and insect hunting activities that systematically undo hours of agricultural labor. Medieval poultry management required accepting that chickens would always find ways to make farming more difficult while simultaneously remaining essential for egg production and protein diversity. Your evening meal preparation faces logistical challenges that would impress medieval military quartermasters responsible for feeding armies in hostile territory. Available food supplies have been modified by the day's weather conditions, requiring creativity in transforming ingredients that have undergone unauthorized biological processes into something resembling edible meals. The bread supply has evolved beyond staleness into what medieval bakers would recognize as an advanced state of fermentation, requiring soaking techniques that might restore some degree of edibility while removing whatever organisms have colonized your carbohydrate reserves. Medieval bread preservation was a constant battle against mold, insects, and other biological agents that considered your food supplies to be their personal buffet. Your cheese situation has developed complexities that would challenge contemporary food scientists studying bacterial cultures in controlled laboratory environments. The cheese has achieved surface characteristics that suggest it's conducting its own biological research, requiring careful evaluation to determine whether it remains within acceptable parameters for human consumption or has crossed into territory better suited for scientific study. Evening cooking operations must be conducted using equipment that has spent the day absorbing moisture, accumulating debris, and generally experiencing conditions that challenge the structural integrity of medieval cookware. Your pot requires cleaning using techniques that remove biological deposits while preserving the underlying metal components that make cooking theoretically possible. The water situation has become critical since your usual sources have been contaminated by runoff from various agricultural and biological processes that weren't designed with drinking water quality in mind. Medieval water purification consisted primarily of hoping that boiling would eliminate whatever organisms had colonized your liquid supplies, a strategy that worked most of the time and failed spectacularly when it didn't. Your evening meal consists of whatever ingredients remain consumable after the day's adventures in medieval food preservation under adverse conditions. The resulting pottage combines flavors that would challenge contemporary taste preferences, while providing calories essential for survival during continued agricultural operations under hostile environmental conditions. Clothing repair becomes an evening priority, since your garments have sustained damage that threatens their continued functionality as protective equipment. Medieval textile repair relied on whatever materials were available and whatever sewing skills could be developed through necessity, creating maintenance routines that kept clothing functional long past the point where contemporary standards would suggest replacement. The evening's maintenance activities continue by firelight that provides barely adequate illumination for detailed work, while consuming precious fuel that must be conserved for cooking and essential heating operations. Medieval artificial lighting consisted primarily of fire-based systems that produced minimal light while creating maximum fire hazard, requiring constant attention to prevent architectural disasters. Your hands, already challenged by the day's agricultural activities, now face additional stress from evening repair operations that require fine motor control while working with materials that have been modified by weather exposure and daily use. Medieval hand care consisted primarily of accepting whatever damage occurred during daily operations and developing calluses thick enough to provide natural protection. The day's physical toll begins manifesting in ways that would concern contemporary sports medicine specialists studying occupational injuries in high-stress environments. Medieval peasants developed pain tolerance that would impress modern endurance athletes, but they also accumulated physical damage that contributed to shortened life expectancies and chronic health conditions. Evening planning requires evaluating the day's agricultural progress against tomorrow's essential tasks, while factoring in weather conditions that show no signs of improvement and equipment status that raises questions about continued operational capability. Medieval agricultural scheduling was essentially crisis management conducted on a daily basis, with success measured by survival rather than optimal productivity. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants found satisfaction in their evening maintenance routines or simply developed the mechanical persistence necessary to maintain agricultural operations under conditions designed to break both human spirits and farming equipment. The evidence suggests they took genuine pride in keeping their operations functional despite daily challenges that would overwhelm most contemporary people. Your medieval evening represents a typical peasant experience in agricultural crisis management, demonstrating the kind of multitasking abilities and problem-solving skills that allowed medieval farmers to survive conditions that would challenge modern survival experts equipped with contemporary technology and unlimited resources. The night approaches with the inevitability of medieval mortality statistics, but first you must complete whatever repairs and preparations are essential for tomorrow's continued agricultural warfare against hostile natural forces. As darkness settles over your medieval agricultural disaster like a blanket made of exhaustion and despair, you begin to understand why medieval people went to bed shortly after sunset, not from choice, but from the simple fact that consciousness had become too expensive to maintain. Your single candle, crafted from animal fat using techniques that prioritized function over pleasant aromas, provides barely enough light to navigate your hovel without stepping on whatever creatures have taken up residence in the corners you can't see. The transition from evening work to nighttime survival mode requires careful preparation of your sleeping arrangements, a process that medieval people approached with the same attention to detail they applied to military siege preparations. Your bed, constructed from a wooden frame that creaks with the enthusiasm of a medieval torture device, supports what was once a straw mattress but has now achieved the consistency of compressed medieval compost. The straw, having absorbed moisture, body oils, and various other biological contributions over the months since you last changed it, now provides roughly the same comfort level as sleeping on a medieval weapons cache. Each time you shift position, the mattress produces sounds that suggest small animals are conducting territorial disputes within its depths, accompanied by the distinctive aroma of organic matter in various stages of decomposition. Your blanket, woven from wool that has been processed using medieval techniques that emphasize durability over softness, has the texture of medieval chainmail and provides approximately the same level of comfort. The fabric has absorbed enough moisture from the day's atmospheric assault to qualify as a wearable swamp, but it's the only barrier between your body and the ambient temperature that's dropping with the enthusiasm of medieval siege engines targeting castle walls. The sounds of night begin their medieval symphony outside your architectural marvel, featuring performances by creatures that seem specifically designed to prevent human sleep. Medieval nights weren't the peaceful, quiet affairs you might imagine from contemporary rural experiences. They were acoustic environments that combined the natural sounds of wildlife with the industrial noises of a civilization that operated without noise pollution regulations. Your neighbor's animals contribute their own musical arrangements to the evening's entertainment, featuring pigs that express their nocturnal opinions through vocalizations that would impress contemporary opera singers, chickens that maintain irregular sleep schedules and feel compelled to share their insomnia with the entire village, and various other livestock that seem to operate under the philosophy that nighttime is actually the perfect time for important discussions. The wind picks up with the dedication of medieval siege engines preparing for extended operations, finding every gap in your hovel's construction and exploiting these architectural vulnerabilities to create indoor air circulation systems that would challenge contemporary HVAC engineers. Medieval buildings were essentially large musical instruments that played atmospheric compositions whenever weather conditions provided sufficient energy to operate the building-sized wind instruments. Your roof demonstrates its commitment to acoustic diversity through a percussion section that features multiple drip points operating on independent rhythmic patterns, creating soundscapes that would fascinate modern composers studying polyrhythmic structures if modern composers had time to analyze medieval architectural music. The water landing in various containers throughout your living space adds metallic accents that complement the organic percussion of rain on thatch. Sleep, in medieval terms, wasn't the 8-hour restoration period that modern sleep medicine recommends. It was whatever unconsciousness you could achieve despite environmental conditions designed to maintain constant alertness. Medieval peasants developed the ability to sleep through noise levels that would challenge contemporary urban dwellers accustomed to traffic, construction, and other civilizational soundtracks. Your body, having survived a day of medieval agricultural warfare, begins the process of cataloging accumulated damage while attempting to initiate whatever repair processes were available to people who hadn't invented modern medicine, physical therapy, or pain management techniques more sophisticated than ignore it and hope it goes away. Every muscle reports its participation in the day's activities through sensory feedback that would impress contemporary sports medicine specialists studying occupational stress injuries. The cold begins its nighttime assault on human comfort with the systematic approach of medieval siege warfare, targeting every exposed area of skin while simultaneously extracting heat through your clothing and bedding systems that provide minimal insulation against atmospheric temperature variations. Medieval heating consisted primarily of body heat conservation and whatever residual warmth could be captured from cooking fires before they died down to embers. Your feet, having spent the day enclosed in leather footwear that absorbed moisture until it achieved the consistency of medieval sponges, now face the challenge of achieving any degree of warmth while maintaining circulation through extremities that have been compressed by boots that were never designed for extended wear under adverse conditions. Medieval foot care consisted primarily of hope they still work tomorrow and occasional inspection for injuries that might compromise mobility. The darkness outside your single window suggests a world that operates according to different rules during nighttime hours. When medieval people understood that forests contained creatures that didn't necessarily respect human property rights, and roads became navigation challenges that could result in permanent disappearances. Medieval nights were when wolves, bears, and human predators conducted their business, leading to sleeping arrangements that prioritized security as much as comfort. Your door, constructed from wooden planks held together by medieval carpentry techniques that emphasized adequacy over precision, features a locking mechanism that consists of a wooden bar and the kind of optimism usually associated with people who voluntarily chose to live in isolated agricultural locations. Medieval home security relied heavily on the assumption that most threats would prefer easier targets and that neighbors would notice unusual nighttime activities. The animals outside continue their nocturnal discussions with the persistence of medieval scholars debating theological questions, creating soundscapes that include territorial disputes, mating negotiations, and what appears to be general commentary on the day's events delivered in various animal dialects. Medieval farmers learned to interpret these sounds as early warning systems for threats that might require immediate attention or strategic retreating indoors. Your clothing, still damp from the day's weather experience, hangs near the dying fire in positions that balance drying efficiency against fire safety, creating a laundry system that operates according to medieval principles of probably won't catch fire accidentally. Medieval clothing care required constant attention to prevent garments from developing the kind of damage that could compromise their continued functionality as protective equipment. The hunger that has been your constant companion throughout the day settles into its nighttime routine, transitioning from active complaint to the kind of persistent background discomfort that medieval people learned to accept as normal. Medieval peasants went to bed hungry more often than not, since food supplies were allocated to maintain survival rather than achieve satisfaction, leading to sleep patterns that incorporated dietary insufficiency as a standard component. Your hands, bearing the accumulated damage from a day of medieval tool use under adverse conditions, begin the overnight healing process that medieval people understood would restore some functionality by morning while leaving permanent modifications that served as occupational identification. Medieval callus development was essentially biological tool modification that allowed humans to interface with medieval equipment without destroying their manual dexterity entirely. The fire gradually dies down to embers that provide minimal light and heat while continuing to consume whatever fuel remains available for nighttime heating operations. Medieval fire management required balancing warmth conservation against fuel efficiency, since morning fire-starting operations would require ember preservation or complete restart procedures using flint and steel techniques. As you finally achieve some approximation of horizontal rest position on your medieval sleeping system, the day's experiences begin to settle into the kind of exhausted reflection that medieval people understood was the closest thing to entertainment available at the end of agricultural workdays. Your body begins whatever recovery processes were available to people who hadn't invented modern medicine, nutritional supplements, or therapeutic massage techniques. The sounds of medieval night continue their acoustic performance outside your hovel, creating the kind of natural soundtrack that medieval people learned to find comforting rather than disturbing, since familiar night sounds indicated that no unusual threats were operating in the immediate vicinity. Strange silences were more concerning than normal nocturnal chaos, suggesting that something had disrupted the usual patterns of nighttime activity. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants found their lives satisfying despite the daily challenges, or simply developed the psychological resilience necessary to function under conditions that would overwhelm most contemporary people. The evidence suggests they took genuine pride in successful survival and found meaning in agricultural work that fed their families and communities, even when the work itself challenged human physical and mental capabilities. Your medieval day concludes with the satisfaction of someone who has survived challenges that most modern people would find impossible, demonstrating the kind of human adaptability and persistence that allowed medieval civilization to function despite technological limitations and environmental hostilities that would challenge contemporary survival experts. The night embraces your exhausted form with the gentle persistence of medieval mortality statistics, while outside your window, the world continues its ancient rhythms of survival and persistence under conditions that shaped human character through necessity rather than choice. Your breathing gradually slows as sleep approaches, carrying you toward the restoration that medieval people understood was essential preparation for tomorrow's identical challenges. In the distance, you hear the soft sounds of other peasants settling into their own medieval sleeping arrangements, creating a community of survival that persisted through shared hardship and mutual understanding that agricultural life required everything human beings could give, and sometimes more than that. Your eyelids grow heavy as the day's accumulated exhaustion finally claims its victory over consciousness, drawing you into the kind of sleep that medieval people earned through daily encounters with challenges that tested the limits of human endurance and ingenuity. Sweet dreams wash over you like gentle medieval rain, soft and nourishing rather than harsh and punishing, carrying you toward rest that restores rather than merely postpones tomorrow's trials. The sounds around you fade into comfortable background whispers as your breathing deepens and your body finally releases the tensions of a day spent in honest labor under conditions that challenged but did not defeat your fundamental human resilience. Sleep comes at last, peaceful and restorative, wrapping you in the gentle embrace of earned rest after trials met with courage and persistence that would have made your medieval ancestors proud.